If you love to make fresh bread, but hate how much of it goes to waste, then this is for you. I'm Gemma Stafford, a pastry chef with over 20 years experience, and this is the bread I bake at my house to feed my small family. We're going to make one simple dough and bake a single loaf so you get fresh bakery-style bread without the waste. Now, I am all about a no-knead dough, and I have many different ones on my website because you don't need a machine, you mix it all up by hand, and you just use time to knead your dough and help the gluten strengthen and form. For my bread, I use bread flour, and the reason I do that is because it's higher in gluten, so it gives you extra stretch, extra chewy bite, and also is better at capturing bubbles in your bread than all-purpose flour is. So bread flour is a really fantastic thing to have on hand when you're making little breads like this. Because it's a small batch bread, we only need a small amount of flour. Into our flour, we're going to add a small amount of salt. Every loaf of bread, no matter how big or small, needs a decent amount of salt. Otherwise, it can actually be quite flat tasting. So into this, we're going to add in our yeast. It's a yeasted dough. So what I like to do is instant yeast, because instant yeast can go straight into your flour, just like any other ingredient. It's really simple. And if you're not used to using a lot of yeast in your baking, go for instant yeast. I'll tell you why. Active dried yeast, which is a different type of yeast, you do have to use a different quantity, but you also have to activate it in warm water. So you have to go to that extra step where instant yeast just goes straight in there and does its thing. I have a note on biggerbolderbaking.com with this recipe about how to use the different yeasts. Give that a little mixy mix. Lovely. So for our liquid, we have here some warm water, or what I say is blood temperature water. And somebody asked me recently, what do you mean by blood temperature or lukewarm water? And this is what I mean. I heat it up in the microwave or in the kettle. When I put my finger into the water, if I can't feel the water around my finger, it means it's a similar temperature to my blood, which is perfect for yeast to feed on, yeast to activate, and for yeast to grow and thrive. So you want a little bit warmer. Because we're making this dough all in the one day, and it's not like a slow proof over time, we do want to give our yeast that little bit of a helping hand with lukewarm water. Into the water, another thing that helps feed the yeast is honey. Look at that. Yeast is a living thing. It thrives on warmth. It needs to be fed. And one thing it loves is sugar. So a little bit of liquid sugar in there makes yeast very happy. And also the presence of sugar in a dough, you can actually see on the surface of your bread. It kind of creates these little bubbles all around the crust of your bread, making it look really beautiful. There we go. Mix those two together, then wet into dry. So once the wet hits the dry, even if you look into my bowl here, you can see the yeast is already activating. And with the helping hand of that warm water, it means that we can make this loaf all in one day, and the yeast will have everything it needs. With a spatula, I like to mix this together. You can also use your hand. Just mix it until all the flour is hydrated. And we have a ball of dough. So I'm going to proof it in this bowl, and sometimes what I like to do is just grease the bowl a little bit. Like I said, yeast is a living thing, and while it's proofing and activating, you want to make sure that it has an easy time gliding up the side of your bowl. And if you put a small bit of oil in there, it will really just help your dough along. I do it both ways. Sometimes I use oil, sometimes I don't. Okie dokie, on with our lid. We're going to set this dough aside at room temperature to proof for around 2 hours. So because this is only a small loaf, enough for, 2 people or so, the little dough doesn't take that long to proof, so 2 hours is perfect. Now, if you want to keep it and put it in the fridge after the 2 hours, feel free to do that, up to 2 days. The more time you give a dough, any type of dough, the more flavor develops. The texture will be better, it'll get stronger, it'll be more bubblier. So if you do have the extra time, experiment a little bit. That's what I do. Sometimes I bake it the day of, sometimes I give it a day or 2 in the fridge, and you will notice a difference. Sometimes when you don't have a lot of time and you do want a freshly baked loaf of bread, then the 2 hours is perfect. As you can see, it has doubled in size. See all those air pockets there? That is the gluten forming. Do you see that in here? So this is why we didn't have to knead on a machine, because time is a beautiful thing. And in the bowl, the gluten developed, the yeast went to work, and the gluten has strengthened, giving us those lovely gluten strands. And even those 2 hours, rather than just mixing on a machine, those 2 hours give you improved flavor than an average dough made on a machine. So I am all about no-knead doughs. Now, flour your surface a little bit, turn out your dough. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to pull and fold. And this is another step that you're kneading yourself, but not on a machine. It's not the traditional way. So what we're going to do is just pull the dough, fold it over itself, and pull it. We're knocking out the air. Remember all those bread recipes that we did that said knock out the air? Never really told us why. I thought when I was a novice baker that you were knocking out the air on all the bubbles and that you shouldn't do that. And I couldn't understand why. And years of being a bread baker, working professionally as a bread baker, knocking out the air and pulling and stretching the dough strengthens the dough. And what it allows, because your dough is now stronger, it can catch more bubbles. If it's not a strong dough, it can't hold those big, lovely bubbles that we see in fermented doughs. So pull and fold. It's simple, it's not complicated. Pull it, fold it, pull it, fold it. There's no fancy technique. Do as many pulls and folds as you can until your dough just won't pull and fold anymore. You'll get to that point. Create a little bowl. Number one, if you wanted to bake this in a loaf pan, you could in a small loaf pan. So what you want to do is use the table you're working on. When you are trying to shape a dough, you actually want very little flour. You want the dough to adhere to the counter. A little bit of flour on my hands. Work the dough by pushing it into the counter a little bit, and it bounces back in your hands and creates this perfectly round bowl. And you know you've done a good job that when you turn it over, there's very little seam. My secret weapon, not so secret because everybody does it, baking my bread in a Dutch oven. I have a piece of parchment here. I'm going to lift up my bowl. I like to proof in my Dutch oven. Some people use baskets. Whatever works for you. I find this is more straightforward and less of a step. So what I'm going to do now, put on the lid, leave it at room temperature for an hour, let it double in size, and we'll come back, we'll check if it's proofed. If it is, we'll score it into the oven then. So now I think I heard a few people say, what if I don't have a Dutch oven? That's kind of like my superpower. Here's what to do. I did this for many years before I had a Dutch oven, and it works beautifully. You can use a good quality tray, a nice like heavy tray. You'll put this into the oven. You can slide on your proof dough if it's ready to be baked and cover it with a metal bowl. By doing that, the bowl is creating steam between the tray and the bread, and you still get that great effect. You still get that chewy crust. You still get that pop in the bread. So this is a great solution. But I do have to tell you, you can't use any type of metal. Please make sure the bowl that you use is high quality stainless steel, grade 304, 316 or 430. Very important. Otherwise, your bowl will warp in the oven. So it has been around an hour. Our dough has proofed. I think that has definitely doubled in size. So a question I get a lot is, how do you know if a dough is proofed regardless of the size? And there is one telltale sign. I'm going to put some flour on my finger. Poke your dough. If your indentation stays in the dough, it means it's proofed. If the dough pops back under your finger, it's not ready. It needs more time to proof. Put the lid back on. Be patient. Once you know it's ready, let's get it into the oven. What I like to do, because this is like a bakery style bread, I do like to dust the top with a little bit of flour. And I'll tell you another reason why I do that. It gives you a lovely look, but also it makes it easier to score. I'm not the best bread scorer, so I just find it easier. So I use a Stanley knife. This is what I've always done. And I'm going to do just 3 slits into the bread. Somebody asked me the other day, I actually think it was George, my son, why do you score bread? So the reason you score bread, the main reason is actually not for look. The main reason is that it's going to create steam in the loaf when it's baking. You need to give that steam a vent to escape from. So any scoring that you do will be a vent for steam to escape. If you do not score your bread at all, you will get this kind of blown out side of your loaf, or even on the top of the loaf. It doesn't look bad, it looks very homemade, but that is the steam trying to escape when it wasn't given the space to do so. So do a nice score, it helps the steam escape, and it makes your bread look good. So the benefits of baking bread in a Dutch oven is just really spectacular, because what it does is creates this like oven, a really hot oven to put your dough into. You put on the lid, and when you put on the lid, it creates steam, which helps to rise your loaf, and it also gives your loaf a chewy outer crust. So it's really, really a fantastic way to bake. Just a little thrifty tip, definitely if you're looking for a Dutch oven, check out TJ Maxx, check out Marshall's, even Ross. You can get some really good quality ones for really cheap. This is ready for the oven. Lid on. Oven preheated, let's go. So we're going to start in a very hot oven, 425 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes, lid on. After 20 minutes, lid off, turn down the temperature to 400 degrees Fahrenheit and then let it bake for the remaining 20 minutes or so until it's really lovely golden brown. While it is baking, I'm going to do some bowl baking hotline questions. And this is great around bread because lots of people have different experience with bread. And I want to make sure that we're all able to like make doughs, use yeast and all that stuff. So somebody asked, can I double this recipe? Yes, you can double the recipe. Then it's a full loaf of bread. And I have lots of full loaves of bread on my website, or you could just double this recipe. This is perfect. We are a family of 3. This is the bread that we will go through with no waste. Even with one person, this is the perfect loaf for you. Now, the next question was a great one. Can I freeze the dough raw? I would say no to that. Don't freeze raw yeasted dough because often what happens is you do not get the exact same dough defrosted and baked. You just will not get the same results. So I would recommend baking your bread, slicing it and freezing it, or just freeze the whole loaf, but don't freeze the raw dough. Last but not least, somebody asks, can I add whole wheat flour? That's a great question. The answer is yes. My rule of thumb is half white, half whole wheat. Do not do 100% whole wheat. Your dough will be very heavy and stodgy and probably inedible. So half white, half whole wheat. And on that note, if you wanted to add in a few seeds, maybe raisins, some nuts, whatever you want, you can scatter a few in there, no problem. It's quite a versatile dough. So on that note, I think the timer went off. I want to take off the lid and let the steam come out. So when your loaf comes out, it's a beautiful golden brown, just like this one. And it has kind of that shine on it because of the steam we created by putting on the lid. So it really does, all those little elements really make a difference. Now, this is very hot. I'm digging my life into my own hands, but listen to this. That is music to my ears. 20 minutes with steam gives you a shiny crust and a chewy crust. Then time baking with the lid off gives you that dry crust. The longer you have the lid off, the thicker the crust. I do around 20-25 minutes and you get the best of both worlds. I'm going to stop mauling the bread now. I'm going to let it cool down because when it's cooled, that's when we can slice it. The reason I love this loaf is because it's the perfect amount of bread for my small family of 3. It's only made with 5 ingredients. It takes a couple of hours. And in the end, you get the most beautiful, cutest little loaf of bread that really is full of flavor. And when you slice the bread, you see the air bubbles that were created over the no-knead process. And in the end, you get the most beautiful, cutest little loaf of bread that really is full of flavor. So not only does it have lovely flavor, but great texture too. I really hope you enjoyed this small batch recipe. And if you want more videos and get comfy, I've got hundreds for you to check out. Thanks so much for watching and I'll see you back here again really soon.